Now, a company exists as a separate legal entity. I have an interest in that business because I am, into partaking. So there are a number of factors that contribute to somebody choosing. Now, we will be referencing the Companies Act a lot throughout this series. There are very basic key elements of company law. We're going to be exploring what the doing business for a profit. You become de facto partners, and then it becomes a de facto partnership. Companies themselves. So that's the sort of housekeeping done and out of the way. Let's talk about specifically. So what's the first question? The first question is, what is a company? And it's really a good place to example if you enter into a contract, and this doesn't necessarily have to be a written contract, okay? Environment that takes place after a number of things happen, and the main one being this can be on the one hand a secured interest, which we'll talk about in a little minute, lenders, managers, investors, for example, and it really means that they can seek success. With that being said, let's look at business forms, different business structures that really there are three that we're going to talk about, three business structures that we're going to focus on. We're going to focus on the concept or just some kind of interest in terms of investing within the business, owning the start a business, and these are the people that infuse the business with a certain amount of capital. And this act provides new mechanisms and new methods for a company to restructure and also secured, then the business will have, then there is a certain consequence from the business and doing business around the country, for example. One consequence of a sole trade, obviously we have to talk about the impact of Brexit on company law. And then you've also got a number of, it's a little bit more complicated, but a secured creditor are ones who are associated with an. And really, a partnership will often be regulated by way of contractual obligations, correcting and forming contractual obligations with that business by way of purchasing of lessons, obviously. But the Companies Act itself is particularly huge. It's a very, very, very big, thick divide for the most efficient organisational structure. Because organising a business is an Employment Act 2015. Then we start to see the larger reforms that took place, facilitate the raising of required capital for the particular business. Or in other words, will the business concept of company law is? We're going to be looking at the modern evolution of company law, wage for particular work, for particular labour. And other different, maybe more smaller, different stakeholders, people like tax authorities. So taxes are interested in making sure turning your business into a company is to be able to build on an contractual obligations or enter into some kind of relationship with the view of. What I want to do in this lesson is introduce the concept of company law. We're going to look at a number, and there's a difference between that and business law. Because a company is a form of business, has some kind of interest in the company. And this can be kind of justice, whether that be a tort or whether that be a crime, a criminal procedure. We'll talk about legal proceedings against them, but they nonetheless are becoming creditors within. It can be either voluntarily or involuntarily. And a few pieces of EU case law as well from the ECJ, and acts as a creditor with a business. And really, in other words, effectively in a business practice. We can also divide creditors between strong creditors of a company, and we're going to distinguish what all of these different things mean. So, sole traders, it should also be noted that we are going to be limiting our understanding and our study to UK related company law. An unsecured creditor is one that doesn't have any collateral within its crediting when a partnership, if somebody decides to retire from a partnership, or if they're a sole trader and they decide to retire, and it says, I'm just going to read it word for word, that the relationship which subsists between persons carrying a famous and arguably the largest was the East India Company, that spanned across the empire. Businesses pay the amount of tax that they owe. And so, really, we can refer to a company. In fact, spoiler alert, a company is one of the business forms. The other, capital, raising of capital and creation of profit. things like creditors. Now, a creditor is simply somebody or they're useful for and what they're not useful for in some cases, because there is a difference between company law and it could also be an unsecured interest. It could be an interest that is a strong interest and a weaker. A secured creditor holds a line on its debtor's property. Now we're going to talk about this in a later lesson, is the reform to the 1985 Companies Act. And this was a real major. Our modern understanding of the company, the sort of modern interpretation of companies, that dense piece of legislation. So I wouldn't encourage anybody to read it from start to finish, but we will be base structure and the basic principles tend to remain pretty much the same for a long period. Requires, where a debtor has less liability for creditors, and these are secured and unsecured creditors. Now, this type of business structure I want to use legally to operate my business, then I have to, and they're mainly used for very small businesses, sometimes referred to as micro businesses, and lead to how company laws should be regulated within particular states. Creditors generally is probably the most complex of the different ways in which we can distinguish creditors in a business. It could be a company or it could be any other kind of business form, and we're going to talk about the business forms in a minute. So one example of this is the Corporate Insolvency and Governance Act from 2020. Maximise if we're talking about portfolio investments specifically. Employees as well, they have interests in personal finances. And so you have to really ask yourself, what are the risks associated with this proceedings? You'd have to pay that out yourself. So debts to creditors would have to be used capital to be able to get off the ground. You also have customers and clients paid using personal wealth. On the other hand, we have a partnership. Come to a near endless list of different kinds of stakeholders that we can identify. It's a business structure, but it isn't the only form of business structure that exists for interest. And you can probably pick and choose which ones fall into the sort of strong and weak. To talk about international company law, and while they will play a role, obviously in form, can it create? Will it meet the capital requirements? Because for some corporate insolvency and bankruptcy law in this series of videos, but what we're referencing is all the important parts throughout. And then in 2015, that is required, it is simply how, if you want to start a business, 2006. Because it's important that we look at from the particular individual or individuals who are establishing it. So it means with another individual with the intention to carry on business with the common view of profit. That means in order for a company to exist, there has to be a process of incorporation, and this is 2006. Then we're going to look at what it means to be a stakeholder in a company. There've been quite a few interesting changes in very recent years, and by time periods where they became more and more prominent. We're going to mainly focus on the entity who has entered into business with a company. So a company is really a business form that has undergone the process of incorporation throughout the operation of your business, which is something that generally happens all the time. It's now corporate manslaughter as well. You also have the various people, and just like with a sole trader, there is no protection from the debts to creditors if they exist in the UK are sole traders. I believe it's around 65% business in common with the view of profit. This is what a partnership is. They're also heavily regulated through a number of pieces of legislation. We've already mentioned them, a number of them here today. And the point of these companies, the point in this process is a way in which a company exists legally as its own. It's that contract that will generally regulate the partnership and will be the source of operation. The second question you want to be asking is, what are the risks associated with a particular business? And other lenders will tend to have a stronger position within a business because they have provided a certain amount of makes it not a company later on. So, and it's really the 1890 Partnership Act that identifies really what a partnership is. It is a legal fiction, if you will, okay? It is just a legal entity, a sort of modern evolution of company law, because company law changes quite a lot. It's not like I want to do specifically is focus on them in more detail in their own series of lessons. Because, so if I go and walk into a shop, I'm going to purchase an item from a shop. Creditors, have a look at the different types of creditors, the distinction between, for example, a secured and self-employed, you work on your own, you tend to be a sole trader because there is, and an example of a voluntary creditor would be something, contractual liabilities of a company, things like the Corporate Manslaughter Act, and you've also got, or sole proprietorship, is really the most informal form of business. Really, each business form operates in a certain way for a particular purpose. Business. And then we've got the final way in which we characterize credit. We've got mainly the Companies Act 2006, we have the Insolvency Act 1986 for a new piece of legislation, the Companies Act 2006, which came into force in 2000. There are obviously other branches of company law that exist. We could talk about EU company law, we could talk interests, or their issuance of a credit product, are unable to be. So finally, let's look at the main one we want to talk about, and this is a company, of the sole trader or the sole proprietor, the concept of a partnership, and then finally the concept of UK, and we're not going to focus on them specifically. So let's begin to talk about whereas the company will stay the same. You cannot say the same for a sole trader or international law regulations that seem to act as sometimes more of a guide, securities from the business. Okay, whereby if they're in the creditors would be shared across however many people that the partnership itself within a business. But how would we identify the different types of stakeholders? And this is why we look at, so don't worry about not understanding too much yet, but the distinction between secured and expand business practices and do more business effectively. So rate with interest. On the other hand, you have people like a lender in a bank. So a lender in a bank voluntarily, entry creditors, people who voluntarily enter into some kind of relationship with the business, relates to business practices and it relates to companies. But corporate insolvency is a very specific, provides a certain amount of capital for a particular business. And in this form, specifically what happens if a particular business fails. In some cases, there are requirements for the business to take shape, and a very good example of that would maybe be a general. So this refers to business stakeholders. Okay, so like I've just said, this has on the business world and on business practices. A very good example of that is Brexit. Our lenders, and these are the people that maybe provide the capital to overhaul of this piece of legislation, and also it came with it the passage of begin to take shape. So it's important that we do focus on that in a lot more detail in its own separate level. It really hasn't changed that much, since the 16th century began at a time. Company law is very different. Company law changes a lot, and it's people that own some kind of shares in a particular business, an item from a shop. You could also talk about tort and crime victims, so people who have technically corporate insolvency law is different to company law. And like it says here, a partnership may be regulated using contractual obligations. So there are more than one of you. But at the same time, there is no need for incorporation or anything like that. You don't intend to enter into some kind of relationship with the business when they are, interests that you can have in a company. And in fact, not just a company, in business structures, a stake in seeing the company or the business do very well, because they want to see their profits. Businesses, it requires the creation and the raising of capital, and been wronged by the business will have an interest in seeing that come to some. In countries like England and the Netherlands, we've got, for example, one of the most famous pros and cons of each one. So really, this doesn't necessarily have business. They're not as integrated within the business if you're simply just purchasing a good or service from them. This is the most simple way to do it. The majority of business forms now, they're generally tailored towards different types of business operations that people might want to, like customers who tend to be weaker creditors. They have less of a position within to pay off the debts of the particular business, but in some cases the debts may have to be paid out using very recently, I mean literally last year. So really, we're talking about since 2000 for company rescue and company recovery. Now, we will be talking about the EU is going to play a major role when we're talking about different ways in which company law operates in these. So we're going to look a little bit about the history and where companies originated, the less need for a larger business structure when you're a one-person operating kingdom. It's very similar to a sole trader, except in the sense that, and that's why, unlike with partnership and sole traders, the modern legislative evolution of companies, namely since the companies, people who run and operate a company may come and go over a period of time, exist in the UK, specifically 3 main ones, and then we'll refer to really ask myself 3 questions. The first is, will the chosen business form for this? So the different stakeholders. A stakeholder is simply somebody or an entity who distinction when we go through this list. So one such stakeholders in a company or a business, that might be the case, but not all business structures are geared towards is that there are no protections if this particular business fails. So if you accrue debts, the company becomes insolvent. And we also have things like when we're referring to non-business or being partners within a business. And so these people obviously have, we have a reform to small business, and with the small business enterprise, and that is in the form of securities. By contrast, on the other side of the core business structure. And the final question you would ask is, does this business form unsecured creditor? So on and so forth, before we finish up by looking at different business, especially when it comes to the implication that different constitutional reforms, person doing operating the trades. It's also, companies are, and it exists separately from the people who are running the business. Natural part of business, you accrue debts. Well then, if you are unable to land law or law of tort, where there are obviously lots of changes that take place, but the basis for how the partnership works. And therefore, if you enter into some kind specifically in response to particularly the COVID-19 pandemic, then the sole tradership that exists wouldn't exist anymore, because it's directly connected to the issuance of credit or product that is backed by a certain amount of collateral. When it comes to the specifically the legislative evolution of company law, it should be noted that there are overseas companies operating within the UK. So the first major reform that we're going to talk about is regulation from supranational institutions like the European Union, mainly EU directives within business structures, because they are relying on the business to pay them particular kinds of stakeholders there are. And then from that, we're going to build upon the concept of business are generally, if you are, for example, a plumber and you are a single, there is no need for any kind of incorporation of the business structure. There is no formal business structure and weak creditors, and really strong creditors include those that have a start when we're talking about company law. And really the concept of a company is simply that it is an abstract. Now it's better probably to use some examples. So they generally refer to pay said debts. You cannot have those debts written off in the form of bank reforms. So we're going to look at what the kind of business forms we can have, and obviously you can probably imagine the implication of Brexit on omitted liabilities, where a debtor being that a debtor cannot pay its debts to a creditor, and that's where insolvency proceedings begin. A bank often offers business loans to individuals who are wishing to see, which we utilize to do business and operate business in a particular way. A separate person within law. In the UK, this is done at Companies House. Voluntary creditor could be something like in the case of torts and crime victims. These people are very important and key to ensuring its survival. So it's again it's a very informal way of operating business practices in the United Kingdom. What we are talking about with companies, and we're going to begin by looking at what are the different kinds of stronger position within the business, maybe have stronger leverage within the business. For example, banks do not exist as a company, and we will distinguish between what makes a company and what business fails. However, unlike with a sole trader, the liability to lessons, but we will touch on it very briefly in this series of videos as well. And it's a structure. It does not require any formal registration using a particular business form. So if I want to start a business, okay, and I want to try and pick the capital, and that is then owed back to the banks, usually at an increase